Welcome everyone to this Cultivating Success webinar series on integrated pest management. We're really glad that you have joined us, and we're really excited to take you on a journey of understanding and implementing integrated pest management. So this is the first part of a multi-part webinar series, and we hope that you've registered for all the different webinars. We're just going to go over a little bit of an introduction to Cultivating Success, and then we'll talk about some webinar tips. And then our presenter, Desiree Wickwar, is going to jump us into IPM. So I'm Colette DePhelps, and I'm with the University of Idaho Extension. I'm one of the faculty that are leading the Cultivating Success program. And this program was actually established 25 years ago in 2000 by University of Idaho Extension, Washington State University, and a nonprofit organization called Rural Roots. Every year, we offer a webinar series, and you can sign up for future webinars at cultivatingsuccess.org. You can also sign up for our newsletter if you're not already signed up to receive a monthly newsletter that outlines Cultivating Success programs and other programs offered statewide by University of Idaho Extension and our partners. Sometimes webinar format is a little bit new to folks because many of our programs are actually in meeting formats. So I just wanted to let you know, if you're having any problems with your bandwidth, go ahead and close the other programs running on your computer. You can always type into the chat for tech help. Kate Wood, the Cultivating Success and Community Food Systems Program Coordinator, is standing by to help you with any tech issues. If you have questions for Desiree, please type the questions for the speaker into the question box. That really helps us organize the different questions and make sure your questions get answered. This webinar is being recorded, and the webinar and the slide handout will be available on the Cultivating Success website. To get us started, we have a couple of polls that we would like to launch, just to get a read on how much you know about integrated pest management and if you practice integrated pest management. So our first question is, how familiar are you with the basic principles of integrated pest management? You can click very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not familiar. And then, do you practice integrated pest management? So your answer might be not applicable if you are not a land manager. If you are a producer or land manager, let us know if you already are practicing integrated pest management. We can see how many people have participated on our side, and right now about 61% of webinar participants have participated. We're up to 92%, so almost everyone. Just give it another second if you hadn't had a chance to participate. Okay, Kate, do you want to go ahead and close the poll and we'll share the responses? So as everyone can see, we have about 70% of our participants today that say they're somewhat familiar with integrated pest management. Just under 10% not familiar, and then about a quarter of our participants are very familiar with IPM. And then, do you practice integrated pest management? About 70% of our participants say yes, about 8% are saying no, and another 15% don't know, with less than 10% saying that they're not producers or land managers. So thanks for completing this, because this also lets us know that most of our participants today are actually a producer or managing land. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and hand the screen over to Desiree to get us started.
All right, can everyone see that and hear me okay?
Your sound is great.
All right.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Excellent. Okay. To do just one more logistical item before we get started, I want to remind folks on just how to get credits. As a reminder, this is only going to work for Idaho pesticide applicator credits. You have to be present for the whole duration of the webinar. We have to show that to ISDA. And then if you're having multiple applicators view at the same time, you're going to have to get in touch with us separately. So hopefully there's just one person who registered, because basically we need to have everyone's applicator number. So yeah, those are some logistics on that. Another quick logistic, I broke my ankle yesterday, so I'm unusually working from home, and so if I start cutting out, I might turn off my video to save my Wi-Fi. But yeah, with that, we'll get started. Maybe. Okay, so as you all I think know, this whole series is going to be devoted to IPM. In this first part, we're going to go over the principles of IPM. That's a big umbrella. And it looks like everyone, or most people were a little familiar with this. So hopefully we're addressing this at the right level. I am our Integrated Pest Management Program Manager here at the University of Idaho. So I work on IPM in a lot of different ways. My background is specifically in entomology and working on IPM with insects in a variety of different crops, as well as some ornamental settings. And so that's why I'm excited about this. Okay, very first thing we're going to talk about today is what exactly is IPM. We have some general familiarity with it, but you know, this concept, it's IPM. We're going to go over monitoring tactics and tools that are absolutely the foundation of integrated pest management. And then we're going to go over pest identification, the importance of pest identification, and some ideas on resources for that. Again, with monitoring and ID being the really important foundation to establishing an IPM program. And then later parts of the series will go into some of the other facets of IPM. Okay, so we're asking you guys a lot of questions. One thing I would be really interested in hearing, maybe we can just have folks put this in the chat. Where do you manage pests? You know, is that in certain plants, or orchard? I'd be interested to see that. We might not have it set so folks can put that in the chat. So I'm just gonna keep moving, I guess. All right.
Yes, people can
Oh, there we go.
chat and you're seeing that's
Okay,
coming
I see it
through,
now.
just a little slow.
Maybe it's my internet.
Your internet on my side did cut out for just a second, but again, that could have been my computer. So Kate, maybe you could let us know if that happened on your end.
Yeah, it did happen on my end too.
I turned off my video. Hopefully that will fix the problem.
Okay. Thanks, Desiree.
Hey, thank you guys for dealing with my internet issues. Okay, I'm seeing variety of places. Got some orchard, vegetable gardens, some greenhouse stuff, agronomic crops. Okay, so we run the gamut here. Very cool. Thanks everyone for your input. That's useful for us. Okay, so this might seem really basic, but believe it or not, I want to talk about what exactly is a pest because I think it's actually an important idea that we have to have in our head as we're working on integrated pest management problems and really just pest management in general. So we think we know what a pest is, but really, what is a pest? Well, a pest is really this very human-defined term, right? Like, pretty much anything can become a pest. It's something that becomes destructive for us, a nuisance for us, a nuisance for our plants, destructive to our plants and our agriculture. So, you know, a pest can be so very many things. One thing I do want to point out is pest, I think sometimes can be solely associated with insects. And even though I'm an insect person, I want us all to remember that a pest can be anything. You know, a pest can be a disease, a pest can be a weed, a nematode. We can have vertebrate pests, of course, deer, you know, voles. a common one that probably many of you run into. So all of these fall under pest, and that means that all of those we can really think about integrated pest management with. So remembering that a pest is whatever you say it is, and many different things can become a pest. We can even have certain organisms that were never historically a pest become a pest, and we'll talk about some of the reasons behind that in brief today, actually. So could a pest, for one, be a beneficial for another? Again, me just driving home this point that a pest in one setting can be a beneficial in another. So I put up these flashy photos of lacewing larvae because, one, they're awesome, but two, to remind us that, let's say we have this lacewing on the left eating an aphid. That's probably great. Aphids are usually on the pest side for us, right? But on the other hand, if we have lacewing larvae eating the eggs of a different beneficial insect, let's say this is eating the eggs of a predatory bug, then you could actually argue that the lacewing is becoming a pest in itself. Especially, some things we sometimes run into are like, let's say we really need a parasitoid, a really specific parasitoid wasp to attack a specific pest problem that we're having. Maybe we even introduce it into the field or introduce it into the greenhouse. If you have a big lacewing population that's eating all those eggs, that's becoming a pest, even though we almost always think about lacewing larvae as beneficial. So again, just kind of some food for thought as we think about pest management. Okay, what about a pesticide? Again, this is a term we talk about so often and, have a general idea of, but let's define it. It is any substance or mixture of substances that intend to prevent, destroy, or repel, mitigate a pest. Remembering that so many different types of pests can actually be used as a plant regulator, defoliant, or desiccant as well, or act as a nitrogen stabilizer. And this is found in this part of FIFRA, which is our pesticide regulation law. And so, yeah, many different things can really be a pesticide. It can be any substance. Maybe an example, a quintessential example was, Roundup. Well, yes, that's a pesticide, right? Like it helps us manage weeds. But what else is a pesticide? Well, how about soap? Sometimes in our houseplants, for instance, we apply a mixture of soapy water to try and manage a pest. That's a pesticide in that sense, not necessarily regulated the same, but still is a pesticide. All right, so with those terms defined, we're going to jump into integrated pest management as a concept. So when I think about integrated pest management, this is sort of the general idea that I think about. We think about integrated pest management oftentimes is referred to as a systems-based approach to pest management. So the idea of systems-based pest management really is just getting at this idea that you're taking into account the entire ecosystem, even if that's an indoor ecosystem or a really highly managed greenhouse ecosystem. You're taking into account all the different facets of that system when you're considering how best to manage a pest. So what does that process look like? It looks like, first and foremost, like I mentioned a little bit at the start, monitoring your pests and your beneficials. That is truly the foundation. You got to know what's going on in your system. And that includes being able to accurately find those pests and identify them correctly, because our management can be so different, even species to species within the same group. Next, you're going to determine if an action threshold is met. Now, that is a weighty term, and I will define action thresholds, and we'll talk about them in much greater detail. If that action threshold hasn't met, you don't have the pest population that warrants doing something, you just go back to monitoring and keeping an eye on what's on your field or in whatever setting you're managing. But if you have met an action threshold, which can look like a ton of different things, you're then going to select amongst a variety of treatment tactics that IPM gives us. One other thing that I always want to remind people of when we talk about IPM is I think it has this connotation that IPM means, biological control only, putting a predator out in a system to attack a pest. But that is not the case. IPM is really just helping us integrate these treatment tactics, and it does not preclude the use of chemical pesticides. IPM oftentimes aims to kind of use these preventative and maybe a little bit more invasive or intensive measures that we see at the bottom of this little food pyramid-esque figure here. We try and use those first, ideally, but IPM tactics are certainly not precluding the use of chemical pesticides when they are deemed necessary. Okay, so um, as we're again defining IPM, I want to go over a little bit of the history that we'll dive into. And with that, I'll start with just exactly how did we come to have this term integrated pest management to begin with. So the first sort of allusion to this term was coined in 1952, where we started with integrated control. You might notice that oftentimes we go with management instead of control these days, and I think that's an important shift because we used to define integrated control as applied pest control, which combines and integrates biological and chemical control. That kind of implies this idea that we're fully controlling a system and managing it in every single aspect, and that is not accurate. Anyone who's tried to do some pest management knows that we do not control things in all of their aspects. So starting in 1966, we started to see more of the term pest management, which has continued much more to today. So these days, a pest management system is much more, as this kind of definition here at the bottom indicates, it's taking into account the environment, population dynamics of the pest species, so that biology of the pest. When does it appear? What is going to make this particular pest outbreak? What abiotic conditions? So it's taking all of that into account to make sure that we utilize the best techniques considering all of these different moving parts. So it's recognizing, I guess, the complexity of exactly how we go about managing a pest. A little bit different than just chemical control ideas. Okay, so those dates that I gave were relatively recent, up to, the 1970s being this period of change where we're saying, oh, IPM is really important, but the idea of integrated pest management isn't new. This is a really long quote, and you don't need to read it in its entirety, but I always find it so funny because there's from the Practical Entomologist, which is a publication that is quite old, as you can see from language that is getting at this idea of integrated pest management. So it's basically saying, these chemical controls that we are proposing to use, they're not recognizing the complexity of the system. And it's saying they're purported to be these amazing, cure-alls, but that's not the case. And that, taking into account these other biological factors going on is really important. So this right here is the idea of integrated pest management, saying that one tool can't do it all, and that was already being talked about in 1856. So even though the term is new, the idea is far from new. Okay, so just to kind of, again, get at this idea of integrated pest management being something we've used for a really long time, I would be curious to maybe we can put this in the chat. I'll read each one of these, and then if you're up for it, put your idea of what type of pest management, whether it's cultural control, biological control, physical control, what sort of tool is each one of these? That I'm going to read off. Okay, so how about this one? In 1500 BC, the first description, oh, well, no, I lied. Don't do that one. I forgot I put this one. Well, in 1500 BC, the first descriptions of cultural control, especially manipulation of planting times, was found by historians. So again, pest management has been something we've been doing for a really long time. Okay, next one. Let's actually say what kind of control we think this one is. In 324 BC, Chinese were shown to introduce ants into citrus trees to manage insects for them. And this even included a little bit later setting them up with little bridges so they could move between trees and move about a little better. So, what kind of integrated pest management tool might that be? Cultural control, biological control, chemical control? Okay, I see some biological control. I am utterly in agreement. I think it's so cool to imagine people. One thing that you kind of see in some of the history is people would go and take these predatory ants from mountainous areas where they lived and bring them back to these palm oases where they were trying to cultivate food, and they would try and build them a suitable habitat. And that's exactly what we do with biological control today. We say, we go, especially when it comes to, introducing a new agent, we maybe go and take an insect predator from somewhere else, and we try and make sure that our environment is suitable so they can survive and thrive and continue doing pest management for us. And we'll talk about that in great detail in later webinar series, parts 3 or 4, I think. Oh yeah, it says right here. So what about this one? Okay, this one's a little harder maybe. How about in 1732 AD, farmers first began to grow crops in rows to facilitate weed removal? Is that a cultural practice, a mechanical practice, physical control, chemical control, biological control? This one's trickier, admittedly. I think there's sort of kind of two answers for this. I'm just curious what people think. I see some cultural. This is really impressive considering I didn't really define these terms very well, so well done, guys. Yeah, I am totally in agreement. Mechanical and cultural, like it's helping us do more mechanical control through a cultural practice. So kind of cool. We're already, integrating these two different ideas. Oh, let's see. So, what's another good one? How about this one? Already in 1870 AD, we're controlling grape diseases, primarily in France, with wine production. We're controlling these grape maladies through using resistant rootstocks, so grafting desirable cultivars onto resistant rootstocks. What type of management do we think that is? Cultural, mechanical, biological again. I think I see a cultural. Yeah. All right. So as usual, there's like sort of a gray area in this one. Um, we are essentially just using production tactics to, improve in our pest management. Usually we put the use of resistant cultivars under the category of cultural control. I'm kind of changing your growing practices, but I totally see how this could feel like a biological control thing, as well. So I'll just run through a few of these last ones. So just noting that in the 1900s, we got the first biological control of a weed. And by that biological control, I mean in the very traditional sense where like we have this weed problem in Hawaii, and we bring in, it doesn't have a natural enemy in that setting, and we bring in a different agent to deal with it. Or in also about 1900, we started developing strains of cotton and cowpeas and watermelon that are resistant to fusarium. So really delving into plant breeding kind of in that later time. But IPM has been in use for a really long time. These were just the examples I pulled, but there's truly hundreds of them documented. Okay, so then we get a really dramatic shift in our pest management, starting at around the 1930s, but really escalating probably through the 60s and 70s, and arguably up till today. But we get the widespread use of synthetic chemical pesticides. So before, you'll kind of remember that what we were doing was a lot of cultural control, right? Like a lot of our answers were cultural control, biological control, but then we suddenly delve into really predominant use of synthetic chemical pesticides. I should point out, actually, I think I go into this later. So widespread use of synthetic chemical pesticides, which causes a really big shift in how we manage pests, and really changes the whole landscape. So as I continue going over the history of IPM and exactly what this means, I'm just gonna, go through a quick short history here for a little more context. So basically, in about the 1960s, there was, you guys may have heard of this book. I feel like it's talked about really heavily. In the 1962, Rachel Carson published The Silent Spring, which was basically a call to action saying, wow, since that sort of 1930 period when synthetic chemicals had become much more widely used, she was just waving this flag saying, look at all of these issues that this widespread use is causing. And eventually, the response to her book, which was, a real cultural catalyst, sort of led to changes at the administrative level that have sort of trickled down into a great number of our laws and regulations today and people's ideas of pesticides. In the 1970s, like I said, we sort of start to get like these greater controls. USDA creates a nationwide IPM program in our land grant universities. That's what I work on today. The EPA was created. And for those who don't know, the EPA is our primary pesticide registration and regulation body. And a ton of these sort of entities were created to try and help us continue to use these pesticides, but without too many negative outcomes. In the 1980s, we start to see a responding increase in IPM research. This idea of IPM becomes a great solution to some of the problems raised, in the 60s and 70s. We also see the beginning of genetic engineering applications in agriculture specifically. GMO crops kind of come on the scene, and those again are a really interesting shift in how we manage pests and us kind of figuring out how those work in alignment with IPM historically. In the 90s, again, we see a little bit more genetic engineering. For instance, BT crops come into use, still, of course, heavily in use today. Food quality protection kind of starts to become involved in our pesticide laws, of course, something we hear a lot about today. A really important one, I think, is we started to see, just in the 90s, we started to see more of an emphasis on softer and or more specifically targeted chemicals. And what that means is that it's, we go out and we don't spray a compound that kills everything, right? We say, okay, I specifically have an issue with green peach aphid, so I'm going to spray a compound that specifically targets green peach aphid and might leave other things a little bit more unscathed, so that softer chemistry. And that can even include things, the reason I have this little picture of oil here is because, again, those softer chemistries, remembering that even something like a horticultural oil is a pesticide. It's just one that we would call a softer chemistry. All right, so now we get into the 2000s and beyond, and this is a totally evolving scene, of course, but, we see more things like Roundup Ready crops, so that continued escalation of, genetic modification to help us in that selection of cultivars. The EPA continues to enforce things, and in fact, in recent years, and I think we'll talk about this later in the series from a practical standpoint, but the EPA has had to revise a lot of pesticide regulation and application guidance in response to the Endangered Species Act recently. So again, we'll go over some of the nitty-gritty and what that actually looks like for us as pesticide applicators and land managers later in the series, but this is, very much still actively regulating and actively evolving today. Okay, so that is this general idea of IPM and a little bit of the history, maybe helping us understand how we got where we got today. So now we're going to actually dive into what does that look like. So as a reminder, IPM is this process. And so we are going to start today with this monitoring sort of element of this process. So monitoring. Why do we do this exactly? Well, understanding the balance of a system is how I think about monitoring. Of course, it's important to go out and find what pest is present and in what numbers. But I don't think I'm telling anyone new anything or any of you anything new when I say that. But one thing I want to highlight when we think about monitoring is that we're kind of trying to go out into the areas that we manage, the land or the ecosystem, and look at what the balance of factors is going on. So, it's good to go out and determine how many of a certain pest you have. But on top of that, taking into account things like other abiotic stressors, a classic example is you go out into your field and or your greenhouse. Everyone encounters these, and you find some two-spotted spider mites. They are not very abundant, but what you do notice is that you're starting to have drought stress creep into your plants. Well, that fundamentally changes the calculus of how you view that two-spotted mite infestation because mites tend to outbreak under drought stress. So understanding the kind of interplay between pests and abiotic factors, and like we kind of talk about with IPM, understanding the biology of the pest, not just being able to identify it, but understanding something about it and how it's going to interact with your plants is really important. Another thing is just to be monitoring beneficial organisms. And I think I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But just how these things are all weighing on the scales of if you should treat or not, what's going on in your system, understanding what's going on, and being able to forecast future change. That's what we're all trying to do when we monitor, right? We're less interested in exactly what's going on right now for its own sake, but for understanding how things are going to change in the future and what we need to do about it. And monitoring is how you forecast that. Catching problems before they arise, that's a key one. And, another thing I wanted to highlight with monitoring, just because I think it's becoming so much more prevalent and I think it can be really important, is determining where treatment is necessary. I think this little image here is a map compiled by a drone that is designed to help a spray rig only apply a certain compound where it's actually necessary. I think in this case it was a fertilizer. But this idea that if you build even a mental map or, maybe a map with mapping software or digital imaging like a drone, whatever tool you're using, if you're understanding exactly where in your system you need to be applying a treatment, that can help reduce costs and improve treatment efficacy, all these sorts of things, which is another part of why we need to monitor, but also, monitoring throughout different areas of a field, not just monitoring the edges, not just monitoring the middle, not just by the road, all these sorts of things. How about monitoring? When do we do it? Well, of course, the ideal answer is we're always doing it. I jokingly put this constant vigilance banner up here because, of course, that's in a perfect world. But what we can't actually do is monitor constantly. So what exactly is actually reasonable? So ideally, we monitor all the time, but we can't do that. So when exactly do we monitor then? Well, here are the times where I think it's most important. When plants are in a vulnerable stage. So that's going to be when they're likely to be damaged or killed. For instance, oftentimes in the seedling stage. If we have armyworms, for instance, they're notorious for going down and cutting plants off at the seedling stage and requiring replanting or something along those lines. So this could also be times like flowering. If you are in a fruit production system, it's much more important to monitor kind of directly preceding and during that flowering period to understand what's going on. And also when plants are already suffering from abiotic stress. So kind of like I already said with two-spotted mites, if you are already having drought stress, you're going to be more prone to mite outbreaks. And that really goes for a multitude of other stressors. This can even be with diseases, for instance, if you have really, really wet conditions and maybe total soil saturation, that's going to cause the plant stress, but also make it much more likely for certain diseases to outbreak. You can also monitor when pests are most likely to outbreak just based on your understanding of their ecology. So I keep coming back to this point, right? That understanding the ecology of a pest is really paramount in maximizing your management efficacy. So that might be something like using a degree day model to understand when a pest is most likely to be present. So degree day models being something that says, okay, given a certain, they're essentially accumulation of heat units. So given the recent weather, and the fact that many pests development is dependent upon temperature, when would we expect something to happen? So it's not just using this calendar-based approach to understanding when a pest would be present. It's using degree days. So that might be a tool you use to say, okay, I'm going to monitor this pest right now this week because degree day models suggest that it is going to be present. And I forgot to put a link in here that goes to a really useful degree day monitoring site, and I will try and remember to put that in the chat at the end. Yeah, those are kind of the highlights. So just being thoughtful about when we monitor, because I know we can't actually be doing it all the time, but just being thoughtful about when you're most vulnerable, both because of the what's going on with your plants and what's going on with your pests. Okay, how about how do we do it? There are both active and passive methods of monitoring. You know, this is sort of a challenging thing to talk about on a broad scale because, of course, every pest is ideally monitored in a slightly different way. For instance, with insect traps, again, I'm biased towards these ones, but if you're trying to monitor a ground-based pest, one great tool you can use is a pitfall trap. These are just little cups that are inset into the ground and insects wander into them, and they're kind of this passive method. You can put them out in the field and then go check them periodically to see what insects are wandering along the ground on your field. However, um, there is also trapping that happens. Sometimes we will pheromone bait, right? Like I saw some people manage some orchards. So this might be something you're familiar with. You put out a pheromone that attracts the exact pest you're looking to go after, and you try and trap them so as to reduce their population in your orchard. So that can not only be a useful way of understanding who's around and when it comes to pests, but it can also be a useful way of removing them actually. So sort of double duty there. Spore traps are a great one for monitoring diseases. UI has a great spore trapping network primarily in southern Idaho, but it can kind of give some early warning about what spores are around, and if you have conditions conducive to disease, then that might be warranting of concerns. Sweep netting for insects is another great one, or using a beat sheet. Again, we can kind of go about, or we'll go over this a little bit more later in the series, kind of some of these specific techniques. And you can always find more guidance on the UI IPM website about monitoring for specific pests. But yeah, just kind of this idea that we are looking out in the field, both physically, just visually, as well as, sometimes through taking soil samples, for instance, to look for nematodes or spores or even weed seeds. Or we can take tissue samples to kind of see what's going on with the plant, either metabolically or to see if there's, a virus present or something like that. So just these general ideas of monitoring. I think I went through that. And do that. Okay. One thing I wanted to kind of circle back to and highlight, like I said, was, in this bubble here on this diagram, I not only just put monitor pests, but I also put monitoring beneficials. So why do I think that's so important that I include it? And it's because of this idea that I imagine you all are pretty familiar with, but it's this idea that, when we're monitoring, I kind of said we're trying to get an idea of what's going on in the balance of the ecosystem. And a key part of that balance is not only understanding what pests are present, because we kind of view these pests as this harmful thing that's taking away from plant health or even human health. But if you have 10 pests present and they take away 1 health unit from your plant, but you don't account for the fact that there's, in this case, in the middle here, this great lacewing larva again, that's taking away some of those pests, you are fundamentally missing a part of that equation and not being able to accurately forecast what's going to go on in your system. So not only can that cause us to make pesticide applications when it is not warranted, maybe wasting some time and money, but on top of that, we're just not understanding what's going on in our system. Okay, so another crux of integrated pest management is pest identification. So we go back to this idea of this equation, understanding what's going on. Different pests, of course, impact our systems in very different ways. So being able to identify them is of the utmost importance. So identifying the pest, I want to also kind of think about as this whole process, not necessarily just you go out in your field with your hand lens and you find aphid and you have to be able to identify it. One, that's an extremely difficult task, so it's great that we don't just have that. But on top of that, we can just kind of make this whole process easier by kind of viewing it as multi-steps. So first, you're going to want to identify the affected plant. And the reason behind that is we have great host specificity in a lot of our pests. And what that means is that many pests can only impact a certain type of plant. So, this is helping us whittle down the potential list of pests without having to, go to a dichotomous key to identify a specific aphid based on the exact number of little hairs it has on one joint, because that's the level of specificity we need to get to some species identifications. But usually there can be ways to simplify this, and a great one is identifying the plant to kind of get at this relationship that's going to help you narrow down your pest list to begin with. Identifying the symptoms. So what is this pest causing? Being able to describe those symptoms is great, not only if you're gonna, just try and do sort of an internet search, but also if you're gonna try and consult with someone in extension or a crop advisor or whatever that looks like. Being able to identify those symptoms and describe them. Reviewing potential environmental stressors. This is one that I want to highlight. So again, you're imagining going out in the field and you see, this particular plant is suffering from wilting. Well, what could be the potential environmental stressors? Does it necessarily have to be a pest? I'm a pest person, so maybe my head would go to, if this plant is wilting, maybe there's a root feeding insect at the bottom that's causing it to be unable to draw up moisture and nutrients. But, if we kind of further process that and think about all the options, maybe there's an issue with irrigation or soil salinity or all these other things that could maybe be an environmental stressor. If not, look for the pests and or their signs. Of course, easier said than done, but we went over a couple of these ideas on monitoring. But I wanted to also point out that we're not always just looking for a pest, particularly when it comes to diseases, because we can't see the pests, they're microorganisms. But, we're also looking for things like its sign. And again, if you're looking for guidance for specific pests, we have a bunch of this on our IPM website, and there's a number of other excellent resources. Looks like, kind of sawdust in a field or within a stem or by the base of a stem, for instance. So you might not be able to see the pest. It might have already left, or it might be so small that it's really challenging to detect. But looking for those signs, knowing what you're looking at can be a really great one. And of course, the symptoms kind of cyclical there. Determining the distribution of the disease and its severity is another great thing to have in your back pocket as you are identifying the problem and either describing it to someone who might help you manage or determining yourself what you want to do. Do's and don'ts for online resources. Just some general ideas here. Do use reputable resources. One thing, of course, I want to highlight is using regionally relevant resources is something we can forget about. But the ways that pests interact in our system are a little bit different depending on different areas. And so I would always recommend to try and go for those first. One thing I want to caution against is the use of AI tools to identify pests. And that's not to say that you couldn't use it to kind of get to a course level of identification, or get some ideas on what to look into further. But we oftentimes find that the identification recommendations that these provide are not 100% accurate. Okay. Another technical idea I want to go over is this idea of an action threshold. And what exactly does that mean? An action threshold is this idea of when you should take action to manage a pest. So I would love to see your answers in the chat of how do you decide when to treat for a pest? Just some general ideas, whatever kind of pest it might be. Sometimes a calendar date, I see. By how many plants are affected? Yep. Economic threshold, a specific one. Oh yeah, preventative treatment. Yeah, maybe if you know like field history, or you know that last year you had a specific problem and you're planting the same thing. Severity of a specific damaged plant. Yeah, all of these are looking at pressure. Yeah, all of these are totally valid ways to decide. So I'll go over some specific definitions of different types of thresholds that you guys were all already describing or already using these. But maybe these can help us understand them in more detail. So the first one, the idea is a damage threshold. So the level that is actually kind of a precursor to an action threshold, I would say. It's this idea of us trying to understand our system. So damage threshold is a level of damage a crop can sustain without seeing yield loss. So I put a picture of Colorado potato beetle on here because they can be such crazy defoliators. So at what level of damage, what level of defoliation do we actually start to see reduced potato production, for instance? And that's going to be what we mean when we say damage threshold. How about economic injury threshold? This is the lowest pest density at which economic damage occurs. So, for instance, what we're going to see, with this first idea, we say damage threshold. That's the level of damage that causes economic injury. Subtle difference here, this is the pest density at which economic damage occurs. And we define these two terms separately, in part because they're different numbers, of course, like the amount of defoliation that you can sustain before you lose tubers is different than the number of Colorado potato beetles. And sometimes we have research just on one, and sometimes we have research just on the other. So that's a little bit why these are separate terms. They're also different for each pest, right? Like we could have the same amount of defoliation in a potato plant could, will universally just about cause the same amount of yield loss. But one Colorado potato beetle might be able to inflict more defoliation damage than another defoliating potato pest, even like an aphid, for just causing those leaves to desiccate and fall off. So those are these two separate ideas at the beginning. And then we get to the actual action threshold, which sometimes you'll hear referred to as an economic threshold. And that's the level of pest abundance or damage at which treatment should be made to avoid economic injury. So, commonly the way we're going to see that is if you have, to continue with Colorado potato beetle, I don't actually remember the threshold off the top of my head, so don't quote me on this, but, we might say if there are 4 late instar Colorado potato beetle per plant, then this is justified to spray this. And there's a couple of different ways that we could really think about this, right? Like it can be to avoid economic injury, like we're talking about here, saying that the cost of a spray is going to be less than the cost of increased damage from that pest. Um, One thing I always point out when we talk about action thresholds is they can be kind of tricky to use. So this is a really data intensive thing to understand. And unfortunately, this data can be really challenging to create for researchers. It can take multiple seasons and a ton of different trials. For instance, you might, yeah, it can be really challenging to produce in a research capacity. And then also, particularly when we're talking about economics, things can get really muddy. The economics might be very much based on market prices. Of course, also it's going to be based on the cost of your treatment tactic. Not only did these things shift every year, even if you're talking about the same treatment tactic, the same chemical might cost a different amount year to year, but the details of its application, and how much that's going to cost is also really variable. So one thing I often want to remind folks is that when it comes to looking at action thresholds, if you do enough Googling, you can probably find a suggestion of a economic sort of action threshold for a particular pest and a particular crop. But that does not mean you should just take that and run with it and blindly trust it. I think that it's really important to try and use local data when you can. If it's not exactly local or it was developed a really long time ago when treatments were really different or cultivars were really different, take it with a bunch of grains of salt. So they can be useful in some circumstances, but a lot of grains of salt there. And also, one thing I want to point out is we're not always going based on economics, right? I think I saw we had one turf person. You all probably have, some flowers in your garden or something where there's no economic threshold to even be found. So sometimes what we get is an aesthetic threshold. And that's just the level of pest abundance or damage at which the cosmetic damage is significant enough to warrant management. And this one's also really tricky. These thresholds are universally kind of tricky, because what we're not concerned about here is economics. We're concerned about what level of aesthetic damage is acceptable, and that's so variable. This level of insect damage you see on this turf grass here might be acceptable in this particular setting, but put it on, a PGA golf course, and that's completely and utterly unacceptable. So, more things to think about as a pest manager. If you're working with something that's more of an aesthetic system, what level of damage are you willing to sustain? In the interest of time, I'm just gonna blip through these. So if you don't have a threshold given to you that you can rely on, what questions can you ask? So first, what losses might this pest cause? Understanding that ecology, considering the life cycle of both the plant and the insect, how they overlap. At a certain point in a season, defoliation might not cause any yield loss at all. Kind of taking that into account. How much damage can you tolerate? This can be economically based for some, and it can be aesthetically based for some. But having this as an idea, because it's almost never going to be possible to remove all of the pests, what level of damage and pest presence can you actually tolerate? What might the costs and consequences of treatment be? Sometimes I think we can kind of view this beautiful silver bullet of a treatment, and then lo and behold, there can be some, you know, issues later down the line with other consequences of treatment, for instance, a secondary pest outbreak or whatever that might look like. So, again, thinking about this holistically and for the future. So, another reminder that eliminating all pests is rarely feasible or advantageous. So keep that in mind and avoid unnecessary treatments when you can. Um, but yeah, IPM provides a lot of potential tools that can hopefully prevent us from needing to apply anything to begin with. Okay, so I think now we have, oops, I think we have another poll for you guys. Do we want to launch that now?
Absolutely. Kate, can you go
Excellent.
ahead and launch that poll. And thank you, Desiree, for that really thorough introduction to integrated pest management and different considerations. So now that you've participated in this webinar, how much has your understanding of the principles of integrated pest management increased? There might be a great increase, some increase, or no increase. And then our second question is, now that we've discussed not webinar tools, but IPM tools, that's a little glitch on our side. Do you practice integrated pest management? So Desiree went over all different aspects of integrated pest management. That might have shifted your understanding of whether or not you already practice integrated pest management. So we have almost 90% of our participants that have participated in our poll. We'll just give it a couple more seconds before we share the results with you. Okay, Kate, how about ending the poll and sharing the results? Great. So as you can see, about 25% of our participants today, their understanding of the principles of IPM increased quite a bit, and about 75% somewhat. So, and we see that at least everyone got something out of today's webinar, some increase in understanding of IPM. So that's fantastic. And then as a result of watching the webinar, we find that everybody understands that they are practicing integrated pest management at some level. So again, that's also really fantastic. So thank you, Desiree, for this introduction. Our next slide is going to show you what is coming up in terms of our IPM webinar series. So as you can see, our next webinar is this Thursday, March 13th, again, 11 a.m. Pacific, 12 Mountain. We're going to be talking in more detail about pest monitoring and identification. There is one pesticide credit available for that webinar. So if you are seeking pesticide credits, just remember you do need to participate in these credited webinars live, and it is also very helpful if you are in a cohort with other people that each of you are registering separately and watching the webinar from your own device. Next week, on Tuesday, March 18th, we'll be talking about cultural and physical pest control. We do not have a pesticide credit available for that particular webinar. It'll be a fantastic webinar, so we do hope that you join us regardless of the credits that are available. And then our last two webinars, which are March 20th and March 25th, both qualify for pesticide credits. We're going to be talking about biological control on March 20th, and then the role of chemical control in formulating an IPM plan on March 25th. Each one of these webinars needs to be registered for separately. That helps Desiree track who's participating. And if you've entered your pesticide certification or pesticide applicator number, then she's going to be able to do the paperwork so that you get your credit. So definitely visit cultivatingsuccess.org, our webinar series page, sign up for our upcoming webinars. Every webinar is recorded and will also be posted on the Cultivating Success website and linked to the Cultivating Success YouTube channel. So again, Desiree, thank you for your presentation today and for putting together this entire series on integrated pest management. And we really look forward to connecting with you all on Thursday.